Welcome everyone. It's 3 o'clock in the UK. We're going to kick things off. This is the culmination of a series of webinars we've been holding over the past 5 weeks, where we've been concentrating on different aspects of the brewing process. It's with a specific emphasis on malts and being crisp malt. So we've looked at certificates analysis, we've looked at milling, mashing, boiling and fermentation. And now we're going to kind of round all of those topics out by having a panel session with some very knowledgeable people from across the industry. And we've been asking for questions over the past week to put to that panel. And now I'm going to introduce them and they're going to join me on screen. So first of all, we have Herren from Crisp Malt, one of my colleagues, who's been doing a lot of presentations the past few weeks. He's our master brewer. Next we have Andrew, whose surname I always mispronounce, but I'm going to give it a shot anyway. It's Wally. It's Wally will do. Wally, excellent, very good. Who's International Sales Manager from Charles Farm, who are also one of our distributors in the UK, very strong partners of Crisp Malt. So we're very glad to have you, Andrew. Andrew Paterson is next, from Yeast, who's also been doing some excellent Facebook Live presentations the past few weeks to great acclaim with his overhead projector and his marker pens. It's been good to watch. Next we have Brian Dixon from Northern Monk Brewery. Thanks for joining us, Brian. And on the line from this darkest Peak District, we have Stuart Swan from Howardtown Brewery. Say hello, Stuart.
Hello, Stuart.
Excellent, thank you very much, man. So I think Stuart is rushing around the brewery and packaging things up. So he might very well drop in and out, but hopefully be with us for the whole session. So we've got an hour. We're going to rattle through a list of questions which you've very kindly submitted to us by email or through the Zoom registration page. A whole host of different topics, which we hope that you'll find really interesting today. The session will be recorded, and we'll make that available online afterwards. So what I'm not asking people to do today is ask questions in the chat window, because we simply won't have time to answer them, but we do hope to do more sessions in the future, and we might very well just concentrate on specific topics. We've left it wide open today, so we have a range of panelists from across the industry who will be hopefully able to tackle those questions. So without further ado, I will kick off with question number one, which has been put to us by a few UK brewers, specifically Michael from Tantrum and Dave from Ride Brew Co. And it's about hints and tips on brewing unfined beers and getting an even haze, or murk, as some people put it. So I'll put this question to Brian, as this is certainly an area that Northern Monk concentrate on, and I'll throw to him.
Cheers. Yeah, we've obviously spent plenty of time on this. I think the key one is trying to sort of achieve that consistent permanent haze. We don't shoot for trying to make the absolute murkiest liquid we can. We'd much rather have a nice medium level that we know is that we can achieve on a regular basis, and that is going to remain there for the shelf life of that beer as best as we can. And yeah, I've sort of going to work through from start to finish on putting a beer together. But I think one of the main conclusions I've come to is just that it's not so much how much protein you're getting in there with your malt, but more what kind that goes in there. So obviously we do a lot of New England IPAs, and there's a key part of that has always been the use of adjunct malts such as wheat and oats, largely initially intended to build out the body and mouthfeel of these IPAs to help that silky, pillowy, juicy finished product. And obviously one of the side effects of this has been this intense haze, which got the attention of the beer. If you look you'll find basically you're looking at malted versus unmalted on this front. So your unmalted oats, so your flaked oats, unmalted wheat, so on. You're ending up with a much higher protein, a much larger protein in solution there. But with this comes a higher molecular weight. So basically, if you're just going with flaked malts, you're going to get a but you'll achieve a higher haze, but potentially more unstable. I've seen studies into Belgian wheat beers where they've increased the unmalted wheat fraction of the grist from 5% up towards 50% and so on. And they found once you go past about 25% unmalted, the haze level begins to drop on these beers. And, a 50% unmalted wheat beer was pin bright. So I'd say it's not all about getting as much in there as you can, but if you want a consistent permanent haze, then you need to mix this up a little bit. And that's where your malted wheat and all come into it. It's part of the malting process. Your proteins are getting broken down into much smaller, more soluble forms, but these smaller molecules are going to survive the process and stain your liquid much easier, and obviously have much higher chance of binding in there and through various factors, and those are going to give you a more permanent haze. So you'll never achieve as intense haze with you've got malted oats and so on, but you're standing a much better chance of a permanent haze if you lead with those guys. So we tend to go for a bit of both. Basically, we found that we tend to go about 2-to-1 malted to unmalted when we're putting together the adjunct portion of a grist, and we tend to avoid going above 25-30% as a total. So that you're looking at roughly, for example, we'll do 10% malted wheat, 10% naked malted oats, and 10% flaked, and that seems to have worked for us. We've had some really good results in that territory. Other little areas of we're forever looking. So another one I was going to talk about as well is if you look at things like chip malt as well, you're actually going to get a higher protein level out of those unmodified barleys like chit as well, and again smaller molecules. So from some of the stuff I've read in studies versus like beers made with 20% chit versus 20% flaked oats, the protein level of these finished beers are much higher with chit as well. So I think on things like that, chit and dextrin, a lot of potential there to build some haze in as well. Little things we're looking at the process size, things like your recirc or Vorloff. We've had a few issues struggling to achieve the level we'd like, and one thing we've done recently which seems to be making a difference is just reducing how long we recirc for. We often did like 20-30 minutes, really try to make sure there's no solids in that work before going into the kettle, and we wonder if that's had some detrimental effect. Basically, you're increasing your lipids, which is kind of an effect on your foam forming proteins, and obviously there's potentially a link there to the overall protein content. And when it comes out to it, we're not actually looking for a pristine, crystal clear work with these style of beers. So we seem to be, in its early days, we seem to be achieving a slightly higher, earlier permanent haze by just reducing Vorloff as well. What else are we looking at? Obviously hopping, whirlpool hopping. And again, I've always favoured sort of going for like the big high oil, dank varieties like Columbus and Simcoe in the whirlpool. As much as sort of adds that count from a flavour profile to add a counter to the really fruity stuff that's going to come later on. But again, something else, I'm reading a really good book by Scott Janish at the moment called The New IPA, which I highly recommend for anyone brewing IPA. But one thing he's seen is like there's actually a pattern where the higher the alpha, the lower the polyphenol content on the hop. And obviously what you're looking for, the whole theory behind this biotransformation and the haze being achieved by dry hopping and hopping as a general is that your proteins and the polyphenols are binding during the fermentation process. So from what I've read, it's worth trialing out things like Cascade in your whirlpool, and even like things like Hull Melon and so on from the European varieties, because they have they're as high as like 5-6% polyphenol, whilst this graph I saw, like the high alpha European varieties like Magnum and Hersbruck Magnum and Hercules were as low as like 2% polyphenol. So something we might be looking at soon to change is look using some of those lower alpha whirlpool hops, because that'll help keep your bitterness down as well if that's what you're seeking in your IPAs, and there's potentially a lot more haze potential in those hops. Dry hopping, obviously there's a lot of the story behind New England is that you dry hop during fermentation and you get this back reaction with the yeast and high protein content of the malt, and that creates this. You see the flavour change of the hops towards more fruity oils, and also this permanent haze. This is no good to you if you ever want to crop your yeast. We only ever do fermentation dry hops if we're doing sort of double, triple IPA, where we know the yeast is going to be no use to us at the end. Otherwise, we get to fermentation, drop to 16, depending on the yeast strain, give it 24 to 48 hours to flocculate out. And as soon as we've got that yeast out, we'll start dry hopping at that stage to try and, maximize sort of protein level in that beer and some level of yeast activity still going on to see if this biotransformation happens or not. And I'm not entirely sold that it's a it's clearly a thing, but I wouldn't say I'm a massive advocate for it being essential in the style. But yeah, if you are able to, if you don't know your yeast, if you're just using packets and so on, then I'd highly recommend trying out dry hopping at different stages. We have done a day one dry hop before, and it was an incredibly murky beer. But yeah, there's protein degradation goes on during fermentation, something to do with yeast, which is a science beyond me. But there is definitely higher protein level and therefore more chance of reaction to polyphenols from your hops if you get those hops in earlier. So that should help on that front. What other random stuff I was looking at? Something else we're looking at the moment is pH at dry hop. There's the optimum haze potential between malt and hops happens between 3.8 and 4.3 on the pH scale. So obviously once your yeast is flocked out and you're getting beers finished fermenting, you see that pH rise up towards 4.3, 4.4 sometimes. There's, I guess, a big argument for getting your hops in, so either back end of fermentation or as soon as possible towards the end of fermentation to get those hops in whilst the beers are in that 4.1 to 4.2 territory. So we've been doing some trials adjusting pH and finding some really good results around 4.2, not just in terms of haze formation, but it does seem to give a more vibrant aroma as well. So I highly recommend tracking what pH you're dry hopping at and seeing if that has any effect. T90s versus cryo. Cryo's great for utilization and yields, especially in centrifuge. You will see yields increase with cryo, but massive reduction in polyphenol content there. So the few times we've done a beer with mostly cryo in it, it has definitely been substantially brighter. So T90, I'd keep your T90 portion high. There's a balance we found as well. I think we found using maybe 20-30% cryo in there, you can get a nice balance between flavor intensity and yield improvements while still maintaining that polyphenol content. Yeast, obviously, ironically, most people seem to use like traditionally flocculent yeast strains like these English ale strains, the London ale and so on. I think you can make a hazy beer with any yeast strain when it comes down to it. We're not trying to achieve yeast haze here. Your yeast is the haze is going to flocculate out, and it's going to give you that yeast bite. We centrifuge, brews that other half and so on, also centrifuge, and that's centrifuge is taking out your yeast, it's taking out some of your vegetable material. But if you've achieved that permanent haze higher up the stream, then whether the yeast is there or not should make no difference. I think one advantage of using these fog and 1318 strains seems to be they don't ferment them maltodextrins and so on, which helps add to the body. And it's a high glitterin content in things like fog as well, which definitely adds to the mouthfeel. And you say there is studies that these yeasts are more beneficial for biotransformation, which I think is why they've become popular. Plus their ester profiles benefit. They're nice peachy stone fruit esters. I don't think actual yeast strain is hugely important in terms of say you're achieving a consistent haze. Pick a yeast that works for you, and know how to haze more than anything. Make sure it's happy. If it's going to if you know it's going to flocculate out slower or so on, and just give it the time to do it. Giving things time to anything that's going to drop out fast, give it the time to do it in tank. Then you've got less to worry about in terms of inconsistent haze in your package, plus all the sediment that comes with it. And then just like it as always important in beer, keep the oxygen levels low, right across the board really. Apart from that, obviously start a fermentation stage. Even hot side oxygenation can have detrimental effects to your proteins. We're reading a bit about manganese levels as well, which is linked to unmalted grains and long warm dry hop periods, which is an interesting one. Manganese is really bad for oxygenation of wort. So again, there's an argument in favour of malted grains over unmalted, and getting your dry hops in, rousing them, getting them utilised, and getting it off as fast as possible. We've never specifically tied a link, but we've seen when we've had beers sat on dry hops for 7-8 days that the clarity is the clarity is improved, the haze has been affected. So we've all seen those high protein contents and so on. These beers are just more susceptible to oxygen full stop, and we've seen the damage that oxygen can do to a packaged beer in like a matter of hours, never mind days. So make sure you're purging your bright tanks, measuring the purging of those bright tanks as well. Like, it's quite hard to get. We found it's very hard to get them as low as we perhaps would like, but we never fill a bright tank unless we get down to sort of 200-300 ppm. And obviously, just do everything gently with CO2 blankets. Make sure you check. Hazy beer and casks is a tricky one as well. How you can maybe definitely some value in purging your casks. We found, especially on low EV hazy beers, the color change by the time they make it onto the barrel cask is quite substantial. So my preference is to avoid casking these beers anyway, but sales teams sometimes win out. So auction at all stages. Hopefully that covers a lot of things. It's a bit of a waffle.
Thank you, Brian.
That's the stuff that's.
I feel like we could probably spend several hours on this topic alone.
Exactly, I have.
Really comprehensive, and thanks for that. So we will move on to question 2, which is really a group of questions that's been put to us by several brewers from across Europe, and that's to do with low alcohol beers. So for this, we're going to employ the expertise of Andrew Paterson and Carl. And the question, I suppose, is, do you have any tips on brewing low alcohol beers using natural methods rather than de-alkalization? Andy?
Sure, yeah. So it's something that Lallemand have done quite a lot of work on recently. And we've looked specifically at the moment at ways of producing low alcohol beer using high temperature mashing. So that's the way you can optimize your mashing process so that you get a less fermentable wort. So what you're really trying to do is inactivate beta amylase, which is going to create the vast majority of fermentable sugar within your fermentation, but allow some activity of alpha amylase. So you still get some level of starch breakdown. So in doing that, you'll end up with a wort that can be probably, 50% fermentable instead of maybe 85 like it would be normally. If you were then to go ahead and use a yeast strain that doesn't ferment the malted sugar, you can leave that sugar behind and you can get an even more stunted fermentation. So then you're probably talking about taking that fermentability down to about 75% of the, about 15% of the wort, 25% of the wort being fermentable. So that's one way you can do it. And doing that in conjunction with a low initial gravity, you can end up with a beer that's probably between 0.5 and 1.5% alcohol. So that's one way of doing it. But I think it's important when we talk about these beers that you kind of consider all the different aspects. So that's one aspect of it, is creating a low alcohol product. But in addition to that, you have to create a low alcohol product that's acceptable to the consumer. So just doing that isn't enough. You have to also focus on the body, the mouthfeel of the beer, how people perceive it, and specifically the pH as well. So I think whilst looking at high temperature mashing is definitely one way to go, one thing that I would never ignore is the pH level of the wort and the beer at all stages. For 2 reasons. One is microbiological stability, because if you've got a pH level on a beer that is way too high, then it's going to be far more susceptible to infection. But also that acidity actually has quite a lot to do with the perceived mouthfeel. So if your acidity is too low, then you're not going to have that crispness that you get with an ordinary beer. So that's kind of, I guess that's 2 tips. I'll let Carl jump in for a bit, and I'll probably come back for a bit more in a bit.
Yeah, indeed. I think that's an important point around pH, because it's way back in my experience when we're producing these kind of things, even with restricted fermentation or vacuum distillation, the pH has tended to creep up towards 4.5. Above 4.5, there are some risks in terms of microbiological stability, and even with kind of food pathogens. Food pathogens can survive at that pH. So it's important that there's sufficient yeast metabolism or yeast activity to kind of bring that down. I don't know, Andy, can you actually acidify the beer as well to bring it down where you want it?
Yeah, you can. That's something that I've been meaning to do a bit of work on, because a lot of the work that we've done up until this point, we've used lactic acid at all stages. But if you're producing a low alcohol beer, you're almost producing what is in effect a soft drink. And if you look at the soft drinks industry, they use a whole array of different acids for their products. So, malic acid, citric acid, phosphoric acid, and they could all play a different role in the flavor profile of that product.
Yeah, indeed. Do they use ascorbic acid? Because that's a good oxygen scavenger as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. You can use that for oxygen scavenging and microbiological stability. I'm not sure if it has it must have a flavour impact on its own, yeah. So
yeah, that's interesting. I know some of the other ways, obviously, the high temperature mashing is definitely the most straightforward way. But another thing you can think about when you're producing these type of beers is to think about the types of malt that you're putting in. So if you use something that's less well modified, like a dextrin malt or a caramel, then that will actually help, because there's bigger chain sugars there, and chip malt, which Brian mentioned, doesn't really have very much enzyme at all in it. That's basically come off the steep and it's been taken to the kiln immediately. So there's not really been any chance for the barley grains to develop any enzymes. So when you put that in the mash, they're not going to convert those starches into fermentable sugar. So that's another way, and that's something we at Crisp are looking at and trying to understand more about, so that we can recommend a suitable grist for producing these type of beers in conjunction with higher mash temps and the right type of yeast that's a bit specific in terms of what it wants to ferment. So yeah, those are a couple of good things.
Just quickly there, Andrew, then, when you say high temperature, what specific temperatures are we talking about?
Actually, way higher than you would normally expect. So it really depends on what you're trying to produce and the amount of malt that you're using. But in the experiments that we did, you was probably talking between 78 and 82. 82 obviously very high. 78 is a bit lower. What you'll find is that you do start to get haze creeping in as you go higher and higher, because you get less starch breakdown. You'll get a little bit of soluble starch remaining.
So I guess the other thing would be like that sort of above 78, 80 degrees, you're going to get leaching out of polys. So polyphenols, and polyphenols can obviously form hazes and complex with proteins. One thing that came to us the last time we talked about this, I think it was on a webinar actually, was a malt that we do called Clear Choice. So Clear Choice malt has basically got no polyphenol precursors in the husk. They were bred out back in the 70s and 80s when we did this breeding program. So that base malt might be quite a good choice for this type of beer, because number one, you're not going to get those leaching out, and so that might help with haze formation, but also polyphenols are quite astringent, so that's really not going to help in your flavour profile. So if you keep them out, that would definitely help.
Have you done any work with acid malts at all, Carl? Because we used a little bit for pH control in some of our pilot brews, and we found that it controlled the pH level throughout the sparging process quite nicely.
It's something we're looking at. We did produce a batch at our sister company, Edme, which they basically make a lot of products for the food industry, particularly bakeries. And so we sent them some malt, and they basically sprayed it with lactic acid, which increased the moisture content, and it wasn't that stable. So we're now speaking to our colleagues in Germany. We have a maltings in Hamburg, and they have that expertise where they actually sour the malt in the process rather than adding lactic acid afterwards. So we're trying to understand whether we can do that, because there is certainly quite a big demand for it. When I'm going around the breweries, I get asked quite frequently. And it is a great way of doing it. What we found with that when we produced was 1% of the grist gave a 0.1 drop in pH. Now, whether other proprietary products from other malts that are a bit more powerful than that, I'm not sure, but something we're looking at for sure. It's a good idea.
Great, thanks for that, guys. So yeah, a lot more of that knowledge and those resources available from your different suppliers who are looking at these questions. Okay, so we're moving on to some hop questions. I've grouped two of them together, and I'll put them to Andrew from Charles Farm. I'd like to know the process and thoughts. What's your preference? Sorry, about CA plus for brewing hoppy beers, and also kind of coupled with that, I notice a lot of IPAs give hop burn when consuming them. What's the best way to avoid this? Over to you, Andrew.
Well, I mean, obviously, a lot of, when I used to give talks to various courses and seminars, I would talk about various things, work boiling and various things. And I'd always, and even maturation of the beers, I would say it all comes down to the brew house. Make sure you get everything right in the brew house and your issues downstream are minimized. So calcium, I mean, it's obviously very, very, very important in the brew house. In your mash, it'll buffer your pH, keep you at the right levels for your amylases to work. So I think what we're talking about here is calcium sulfate. Now, obviously, the different brewing liquors for the different cities traditionally, sulfate was quite high in Burton-on-Trent, where the sort of pale ales and hoppy beers and IPAs originated. And that gives you astringency on the palate. In theory, it helps to promote hop flavors on your palate. So I quite like a dry beer as well. So sulfate will help to give you a dryness in your beer. So, you need to make sure you get your right calcium levels for your mashing. It also will bind with the sulfate. It also helps your yeast. So depending on what your water profile is, you need to make your adjustments. And sulfate, Bernard-Trent was something like 600 ppm or more. I think somewhere around 300 ppm, you don't want to get that sort of that real astringency on your palate. So it's a matter of just checking your waters. I brewed at York Brewery, and our water came off the river. So in the summertime, when the river level was very low, we had very good brewing liquor, very hard water. In the wintertime, it was very soft. So we had to every day do a sort of a titration to adjust our brewing liquors. I'm just, and if you're going to brew a mild or something, you want more chloride. So you adjust your liquor to the type of beer you're brewing. And the hop burn, it really depends what characteristic is meant by hop burn. It could be that, albeit for me to be a hop merchant saying that you can actually overhop beers. I know Carl would agree with me here that beers can be overhopped. There's a saturation point. Oil and water don't mix. So if you keep banging more and more hop product into it, or hop materials into it to achieve more, it just goes out with your waste. And the other problem you're going to get with that is that, as Brian said, with some of the other products, you're reducing your yields, because obviously work will be absorbed into that vegetable matter and then it gets chucked out with your grain. So you're wasting hops and you're wasting beer. So it's a matter of maximizing, the amount of hop material you're putting in to achieve what you're looking for. The hop burn, it could be that they're maybe putting too much in early on in the kettle. You're getting too much efficiency or utilization from your alpha acids. It could be you're going in late and you're actually picking up more bitterness than you think you're doing. When I brew, I work out how many grams or kilograms of hops I need for my IBUs, and I will generally at least half it, if not quarter that, for my early hopping additions, because I know throughout the process I'm going to pick up bitterness all the way along. So my preferred hopping regime was always at the start of boil. After 30 minutes, I would always boil for an hour and a quarter, and in 5 minutes before the end, I would put the bulk hop aroma and character addition in, and I'd stand for 5 minutes just to let the hop oils secrete into the wort, and then usually at a half an hour stand, and then I'd cast to the heat exchanger. So that'd be about an hour. So you've got an hour, 10 minutes, an hour and a half or more of hop material sat, with hop wort, which you're always going to be extracting vegetable matter from the hops, and you're also going to be extracting alpha acids. So the trend now is whirlpool hopping. So as you're whirlpooling, you would put into your whirlpool to minimize that heat contact time, and even reduce your work temperature to 80 degrees, so that you're still extracting aroma oils and not actually isomerizing your alpha acids. And then in dry hopping, depending when you're adding your dry hopping, I guess Brian was saying about the New England IPAs and the various bio transformations we're now finding from the research. I would personally dry hop. I'd finish my primary fermentation, and as I was starting my cooling and skimmed, I would put in my dry hop then, and have maximum of 3 days contact with hops, because the longer it sits there, even as it's cooling down, you're breaking down vegetable material, and you're pulling some of that through into the final beer, and that's going to give you that vegetable sort of hop sack character, I would call it. Whereas you call it hop burn, I would say it's hop sack. Traditionally in the UK, we used to dry hop. We've dry hopped for hundreds of years in the UK. It's not really a new thing. It's just the methods and the volumes have changed. So we would traditionally dry hop into cask. So as you're racking your beer into container, you would add maybe 28 grams of hops, 2 ounces of hops, into your cask, a 9-gallon cask, and it would sit. Now that beer would have to sit for at least a week to gain any goodness from the hops, and that beer was probably good from maybe a week to up to 2 weeks. But that beer would change every day in the pub cellar, and after 2 weeks, you would start to break down too much leaf material, too much vegetable material, and you'd get nasty sort of earthy flavors and vegetable characters. So there's an optimal time to be served. the good thing about hopping into your bright tank or your fermenter is that hopefully your beer is consistent from keg 1 to the last keg that comes off or cask that comes off, because hopefully you're not going to change too much. Brian might contradict me there, because obviously if you've still got yeast present, you're still going to get some changing. But I think you've got more chance of it. So I think adjusting the hop burn it's what works. You know, every brewery is different. Every brewery will work differently. So it's you know, just some trials and errors. But you know, you want to do it late, and you probably want to keep it cool, because if you have if you're putting dry hop into warm beer, there's a chance that you get this hop creep where the enzymes that are in the hops can break down a little bit, and they'll break down any sugars that are left over and create this extra gushing of the beer or foam formation. One other thing about sort of adjusting the hop burn is that, you know, if you're going to heavily hop your beers or have a big double IPA or a bitter beer, you know, it's all about making, in my opinion, again, it's all about making a balanced beer. So you need to balance the sweetness with hop character. Now, we all want really nice hop character on beers. I mean, my preference is pale ales with a nice big hop character on it, but not over the top. I used to like the bitter beers. I'm not quite so keen on those nowadays, but so you need some malt material in there to balance it. So instead of stopping at 2 Plato, maybe you want to stop at 2.5 Plato. If it's high gravity beer, then maybe 2.5, 3 Plato. Or if you're working in barreling 10-8 or 10-10 and 10-12 higher gravity beers. And then look at using dextrin malts or maybe a touch of light crystal, just to give you a bit of sweetness and character behind. So help to balance that harsh hop character that can come through if you're hopping your beers.
Right.
Carl, if you want to jump in, or actually Brian, you might be better to jump in about dry hopping late and avoiding hop burn, because you guys obviously hop far more than I ever did.
I would largely agree. I think I said, yeah, the contact time is that's what's going to pick up your hop burn, I think. And yeah, I say we do basically 2 editions, so day 1, day 2. Sometimes the third day is a really big base, just to and it's a high dry hop just to maximize the contact time. But then by day 4 it's crash, and then after 24 to 40 hours in chill, we're dumping off at least once a day, usually twice a day, dumping off from the bottom, or as fast as we can. But yeah, we dump off as much material as fast as we can to avoid. You're going to pick up that burn, and as I said as well, there's the hop is going to start breaking down, start reacting as well, and you start seeing that hop creep, which you try to match into pack. That's when you start seeing some of the secondary fermentations, and also yeah, it's very important to get off those hops as quick as you can, I think, once you're happy with the flavor profile.
Yeah, and what about your final gravities? Are you leaving a good amount of sugar behind, or are you?
Higher than you suggested. Actually, like some of our big IPAs are more 5 or 6 Plato.
Yeah, great. That's
our core beers, like session IPA, goes to conversions about 3 to 4 Plato and stuff like Eternal, and then we go higher still on the big stuff.
right.
Play around with that as well. I think a lot. We went our final gravities went up and up over the years, sort of that into that 1020 to 1025 territory. I think you need to get your water right, and I say you build in your dextrins and stuff. Some of these yeast strains like fog that leave a little bit of glycerin behind as well. I think one of the things I want to look at is start bringing those gravities down a little bit. I think you can still achieve the desired result with a low, which is, I guess, going to aid stability long term. But yeah, definitely build in building your dextrins and yeah, definitely aim a little bit higher than you would normally. I think if that's the approach you're taking.
I said I like a dry beer.
Another subject we spend ages on. That's great.
Yep.
Thanks, guys. Okay, moving on to our 4th topic, and that's one we're going to put to Stuart, if he's still there with us. Stuart, you're with us? He's got his mute on. The question is about hot side aeration, and whether there are any quality issues arising from hot side aeration. So we're going to try and get Mr. Swan on the line here. I'll unmute him. You there, Stuart?
Hello, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, we can hear you, mate.
Grand, good job. Sorry, we lost the broadband a few minutes ago, so it's all going pear-shaped. have you ever had any quality issues arising from hot side? It's an interesting way to phrase the question, because until we had the new brew house, we hadn't experienced any quality issues that we perceived. The biggest impact we've seen since we've had the new brew house is a fantastically stable and very long shelf life. But we wouldn't have known that until we changed the brew house. So we've moved over from a porter kit, where obviously it's very difficult to control hot side aeration. Very difficult indeed to control it on a porter kit. And we never experienced any problems. We never experienced any of the E2 nonanol off flavour, the cardboardy kind of oxidised flavours which can set in at mash level. We never experienced any of that at all. But we always used to conservatively shelf life our products with 3 months in bottle for sure. And that worked. The beer was fresh. We went down the drink fresh route. Since we changed over to the Sematech kit, all of the mash, the lauter, the transfer back to kettle, all of that part of the process happens under inert gas. So we use CO2 here. It's a multifunctional gas for us. We use it for propelling beer around the site and force carbing if we need to. The canners use it when they come in on site, and it gives us this fantastic inert environment in which to mash and lauter. And I would say the biggest thing we've noticed is a much fuller, rounder flavour in the beers. And now we're getting a fantastic stability on shelf life. We've got some stuff here that we've forced in our shelf life testing. It's approaching 1.5 years old, equivalent out in trade, sat on that nice hot shelf in the shop. It still tastes good. The hop isn't as bright as you would expect. The beer is fantastically bright and clear, and the flavour's still full, and there are no detectable offs in it. So I think it is discussed a lot, hot side aeration. I think it's discounted a lot because none of us really perceive it at the time. But I think until you make a change, then I think it really comes home to you that it is a thing. I always used to dismiss it, I must admit, partly because there was nothing I could do about it. But now there is, I think it is a thing.
That's good. Yeah. I've been along yourself, Stuart, on that. Always been a bit skeptical about does it matter whether it's hot or cold side, but that's really interesting, and I can see how that would have an effect.
Do anyone from the panel want to chip in?
Yeah, I used to run a brew house that had a fairly shoddy equipment, would be a nice way of putting it, I suppose. And it was a 4-vessel brew house, and we had a mash conversion vessel and lauter tun, neither of which functioned particularly well. And we used to get an awful lot of hot side aeration, and we did notice it in the bottled products quite quickly. And it was E2 nominal was the flavour that we used to pick up. And we put it down to hot side aeration because we had very good control of our cold side solved oxygen levels. They were always less than 50 or on filling a road tanker and sending to packaging. So that's what we put it down to, and it was obvious.
Many years ago, there was a lot of studies done on eliminating oxygen in your mashing, so because of the oxidase breaking polyphenols down into oxidative material. But it was sort of, I remember at the time, this is probably 20 years ago, and the Germans actually manufacturing, well, obviously there's wet milling came into it, wet milling's still around, but sort of trying to put a blanket of CO2 and nitrogen on your mash tun and all kinds of things while you were sparging. But I think some brewhouses didn't need it, some did, so it got brushed under the carpet after a time. But there's obviously got to be some kind of a trade-off where you're going to have the breakdowns and the pickup. But from a personal point of view, I would not want to be hot aerating my work, but that's just because the way I was taught how to brew and what I've read and all the stuff I've read in the studies I've looked at.
Yeah.
Very good. Thanks, guys. I think we'll move on from there. to the next question, which is about malt, and the quickest way to answer this, Carl, might be to refer back to one of our previous webinars, but it's how to identify quality-based malt, and just talk about very quickly the variances of crush settings. So
Yeah.
we've got an hour on this.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, we can. I'd certainly refer to that. But to quickly recap, one of the first things is good extract. Obviously, you're paying for extract at the end of the day. You want a decent yield of wort out the other end of your brew house. So in kind of ASBC terms, that would be sort of around about 82% dry. The other key thing, and I think this is where I guess UK malt differs from malt from other countries, is that low protein level. The lower the protein content of the malt, the higher the sugar, or the starch, should I say. And what that also does is mean that we can modify it well. We can break down the cell walls inside the grain. We can mobilize that protein and break it down into smaller polypeptides, peptides, and free amino nitrogen. And free amino nitrogen, essentially amino acids that the yeast likes to metabolize and help it grow. I would say probably more prominent and more available in the UK malt, purely because of the growing conditions. In terms of assessing a good malt, I think looking at consistent corn size when you've got it in your hand and you're having a look at it. Making sure there's no broken corns, no split husks, no admixture, no other grains in there. That would give you a good idea of whether the malt's addressing that malt properly and giving you what you've paid for. Let's say it's Marisota. Marisota is quite distinctive. It's a slightly smaller corn than the modern varieties. There is actually a couple of lines on the ventral side, a couple of little tiny red lines, so you can actually identify that really accurately if you are indeed paying for that type of malt. And that is a particularly good one because that's its mode of operation and the way it works in the mash tun. It can work quite easily between 63 and let's say 67 degrees C. So it's very flexible. The more modern varieties tend to work in a smaller window in terms of giving you decent extract and yield. Going on to crush, depending what type of system you've got, a traditional sort of single temperature infusion system, you're probably looking at a crush of 50 coarse, 40 medium and 10 fine. If it were allowed to ton, you might want to swap those first two around, so 40, 50, 10, and maybe even a little bit more of the medium stuff, a bit more of the fine. Essentially, the finer you can crush, the more yield you get. But the danger is that trying to actually extract the wort off that and run it off will become slower and slower the finer the particles get. So it really depends on the system you've got. So to recap, single temperature, a relatively coarse crush, allowed to ton system, certainly a little bit finer, probably 20% more fine. And then if you're lucky enough to have a mash filter, then you can go basically to a flour, and that will filter out bright wort. So I hope that answers the question.
Stuff. Thanks, Carl. Okay, moving on to a yeast question for Andrew Paterson. What's the best way to use and handle yeast slurry for subsequent batches? So sorry to ask you one that's refers to reusing yeast, Andrew, as a specialist in dried yeast, but you can answer any yeast question anyway. Over to you.
I should probably mention that you can reuse dried yeast.
Oh, excellent.
Up to about 6 generations. So I can still answer that question, no problem. So I guess really the first thing you want to do is make sure that your storage conditions are correct. So that would depend on the size of brewery that you are. If you're very small, I guess you could get away with a bucket. If you're a bit larger, you're talking pumps and storage tanks. And really at that point, you're talking just about temperature. So you need to keep the temperature cold. So ideally less than 5 degrees, but not at 0. And if you can, keep it agitated, so keep it moving around. And then finally, just make sure that you don't keep it for too long. So you're really looking at a week maximum. You could probably stretch it a bit longer if you were desperate. And then beyond that, on the actual reuse itself, I always think that pitching by weight is the best way to go. So get a cell count by weight and then pitch the correct number of kilos for whatever you're brewing. Pitch at the right cell concentration, so obviously lower for lower gravity beers and higher for high gravity beers. And then if you are reusing it, it ensures some degree of nutrition. So using some yeast nutrient on pitching, particularly using a nutrient that includes zinc if you're going high gravity or alcohol, and oxygenating it as well on reuse. So that's kind of, it's not exhaustive, but those are probably the points that I would focus on.
Very good. Thanks for that. Brian, do you guys use subsequent repitches, or you tend to one shot?
No, we've cropped and repitched from packet plenty of times. We mostly are on wet streams these days, but yeah, we've cropped from the New England. I'm on one plenty of times. Yeah, works fine.
It works well. Good stuff. Excellent. Okay, moving on to the next one, and that is for you, Brian. What's the best way to avoid stuck mashes when using wheat or rye? The second part to that is, will mashing these malts individually at lower temperatures separately before adding the barley at high temperatures be of any benefit?
Supposedly, yeah. I mean, it's not certain. Can't say it's something we're able to do. We've always been on infusion mash tuns, so it's one hit. But I'm aware that a lower temperature should help you run off. To be honest, we started using rice hulls about a year ago, and we've never had a slow run off since. The short but sweet answer, really, but I can highly recommend getting some rice hulls in there. Just don't do what we did and add them to your grist case, because you block up your hydrator very, very quickly. So add them directly to the mash tun fairly early on while it's still wet in there. I think it's like mash can help you run off too, but yeah, get some structure in there, and you'd probably be fine. But yeah, I don't know, maybe Carl can talk a little bit more about lower temperature mashing. It's not an area I've really done much with.
Yeah, I've been writing a blog, actually, a pillar post around the last webinar that I did. And step mashing's fabulous if you've got the equipment. I don't know, Stuart, can I bring you in on this? Are you step mashing now, or are you still using single temperature?
Sure.
He gone.
No,
No, he's on.
you might be there.
Stu, are you there?
No, I don't think so.
No,
You might jump back in.
Yeah, so I mean, I know Stuart's system well, and that has certainly got the capability. It's got an MCV and a louder ton, and I've worked with those in the past, and it does give you that flexibility. So if you do want to use a lot of oats, a lot of rye, things that have got a lot of glucan in them, which make them very sticky work, then mashing in at 42 degrees, maybe giving it 15 minutes, would help digest those compounds, because there is some beta glucanase in there. There is a way around it if you can't step. Beta glucanase is quite temperature sensitive, so sticking it in at 65 would basically denature it, and it would work. But there is a fungal beta glucanase that you can get as an exogenous enzyme that you can pour in the tun, and that would help break down those beta glucans without having any significant effects on flavour, and will just help run off go that little bit more quickly. And then, the steps beyond that really are around proteins and proteases and carboxypeptidases, which both can help break down high nitrogen malts, which are a bit prevalent in other countries. And the key thing to remember is proteases work at a little bit lower temperature, so they'll probably work between the rise between the beta glucanase stand and the carboxypeptidase stand, which is about 52 degrees. But one thing to remember is the carboxypeptidases that create free amino nitrogen, and FAN, what we talked about earlier, is absolutely crucial in getting yeast going in those first sort of 24 hours and getting that biomass there to finish the fermentation. So plenty more information on that on the website. That pillar post is posted now, I think, Colin. It's not on the website, it's ready to post, so we'll see.
Yeah, it'll be going up in the next few weeks. We're doing a special on that. On the mash process. So yeah, in a nutshell, get some hulls in there, rice, oats. Even I've seen people using spelt hulls, which are really massive and quite heavy as well. Rice hulls can be really quite light. I think if you sneeze, they'll go all over the place. So something quite heavy, and just open up the bed. It definitely works. Okay, next question on wild yeast to Andy. What are the tips and tricks when brewing with wild yeast?
Don't.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, this one, because the authors said that they're actually brewing quite good beers with the yeast strain that they've isolated themselves, but it doesn't flocculate very well, and that's actually not surprising. What probably is more surprising is the fact that they're getting a good fermentation at all. What you find with most brewing yeast is that they lack the ability to ferment maltose and maltotriose, and they also lack the ability to flocculate well. Those are characteristics that are specific normally to brewing strains. It's not impossible that they've found a yeast that does ferment maltose, because there are some wine strains that will do that. But again, they're not likely to flocculate well. I guess there's a few things that they could maybe try. Co-fermentation with a yeast strain that is flocculant might be a way to go. And then purely on the basis of tips and tricks, if they're brewing a lot with wild strains in a brewery that normally produces clean beers, I would suggest being very, very careful on the hygiene front, and maybe using separate hoses and separate pumps for beers that are going to be including those wild yeasts and potentially bacteria as well.
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, just be very, very careful. I mean, some breweries now specialising in wild fermentations in the UK.
Just quick, just off my head. I mean, do you think making sure you have a good calcium sort of level there to help the flocculation, to increase the calcium, do you think that would help the flocculation, Andrew?
It might have some impact. It's more to do with the genes that the yeast actually possess that cause them to have that flocculation characteristic. So they've really been selected for over many, many generations to ferment brewery worts, and then to survive into the next brewery wort by being. I appreciate that. Yeah. So, to a certain extent, I have suggested that people in the past who have had trouble with poorly flocculating brewing yeast try and up the calcium concentration. So, going up by 5 parts per million until they see some sort of an effect. But I haven't heard any results back from. It's possible that you could certainly give it a go.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Good stuff. Next question on mash and Carl. Is it possible to exceed 90% efficiency? How do we absolutely maximise extract?
That's quite an easy one. Just use crisp malt. Only joking. No, there's a few ways you can do that. One of the key things is to make sure that the crush is right. That's the fundamental thing. Now, if you've got your own mill, you can tune that crushing to your system. And what you need to do is basically keep reducing the gap between the rollers until the point where you start to see an effect on runoff. And back them out a tiny bit, and that's you. And that needs to be done every time you change season, the malt season, yes? So because barley corns, even on the same variety, will change from year to year. So you need to just take account of that. And we can advise on what we found with our mill and our gaps at that point in the year when we do change over. And the maltster should be able to do that for you, because most of them are producing crushed malt these days. Next thing to think about is temperature and mash thickness. So the higher the mash temperature, the thicker the mash, the more efficient it becomes. Not quite sure on the chemistry of that, but that's what happens. So that can certainly help improve. Another thing to think about is the kind of surface area of the mash tun and the material that the bed's made from, the false bed. So is it drill plate? Is it wedge wire? In my experience, and this is bizarre but true, the people who have drilled plate mash tun floors seem to get an extra couple of % extract compared to the wedge wire boys. I'm really surprised at that, but it is true in the few bits of experience that I've had going around breweries and actually really getting stuck into their systems and measuring their extract efficiencies. An important thing as well, which is again detailed in another blog post that I've put out, is just how you calculate your mash efficiency. What you need to do is just essentially multiply up and add up what you've put in terms of your different raw materials, and then divide that through by how much work you've collected and the strength you've collected it at. And that takes account of the whole of the brew house. So obviously using a lot of hops in the kettle, then you're going to lose some of that wort in the hops. One way around that is you can hop sparge. So it's got its advantages and disadvantages depending what temperature you're sparging at, but you can wash some of that nice high gravity wort out and chase that through into the fermenter if you want. Another thing I would say to keep in mind is obviously different cereals have different potentials in terms of extract. The level that you put those in at will affect the accessibility of that extract. So it's whether you put flake products in or malted products, like Brian talked about earlier. It's about when you put them in, how will you spread them across the grist? And I would always recommend like mixing them throughout the base malt, because that'll help. And then making sure that there's sufficient enzyme in the base malt to break down those starches and get the extract. So the thing that comes into play there, and again, UK malts tend to be slightly better on this, is diastatic power. So the diastatic power, which is on your certificate of analysis, or it should be, that you get from your maltster, should tell you really the enzymic potential of that malt. And the higher the DP, the diastatic power, the more likely you are to get good extract in the yield. So those are the things I would say. So yes, in answer to your question, definitely you can get more than 90%. I've got people on drill plate, 10 barrel, 1600 hectolitre, 1600 litre mash tuns getting 94%. So it's definitely possible. It's just about pushing those boundaries and just seeing how far you can get.
Don't forget that we've broken 90. We can break 90 on sort of 4% beers, if not party stuff. So.
Yeah. I guess the bigger.
We can get to about 92, 93 on some stuff when it's optimum grist bed.
Excellent, good stuff. Next question. We've got 2 to go, and we've got we'll make it. What are the distinct advantages, if any, in accelerating fermentation using lager yeast? Like when you're making a Keller beer, can you routinely turn out lager pilsner beers faster than doing a usual lagering? So essentially, we're looking for a shortcut to producing good lager. Is it possible, Brian?
We haven't brewed too many. I mean, when the sort of a cheap answer, I guess, like the fastest, cleanest beers we've done of that style is Kolsch's. Using we've had Kolsch yeasts ferment out in a matter of days, and the flavour profile is cleaner, and they turn around in 2-3 weeks quite happily. I think the sense I get is quite a lot of brewers with regular lagers are brewing Kolsch's under another name. In terms of actual true lager fermentation, whenever we've tried to speed it up, we've found more issues as well. We've had better results in terms of flavour profile and just and better clarifying full stop by keeping the temperatures low and slow. Really, I say we're quite used to lager production. Really, we've done a house lager for our tap room for the last couple of years. But yeah, I think I'm trying to think of any examples now. But we've really gone. I think the warmest we've done is sort of 12, step into 15. But our preference is to keep it at 10 and rise to 14 now. And we've had some that we're happy with after about 4 weeks, but we try and keep tank time to 6 weeks minimum. We've just never been happy. In terms of clarification and so on, I'm sure there's agents out there, finding agents and so on. Again, centrifuge made a big difference for us, and just taking out. But actually, if you're really tight for time and tank capacity, you can towards go down the cheap route of using a Kolsch yeast. And say you more or less treat that one like an ale, really, 2 to 3 weeks, and it's usually pretty bright and tasting clean.
And to add to that, Mr. P?
Yeah, I think with brewing, everything is kind of a means to an end. So is it possible to produce a crisp, good lager in a short period of time? Just look at the macro guys. Yes, absolutely. Yes, you can do it. But you probably have to go about it in a different way. I mean, in a small brew, I guess they might be making the point that if they were to up that fermentation temperature, then they'd see a faster fermentation. But in doing so, you might also produce more volatiles, more esters, more higher alcohols from the fermentation. And then you have to look at it and say, is there some sort of way in which I can mitigate that increase? And you could probably try and mitigate it in several ways. Maybe kind of upping that pitching rate, because your lower pitching rates will give you more esters and more alcohol. So it could be a way around it. So, with everything there comes balance. If you're going to ferment at a higher temperature, then you need to look at other things you can do to mitigate the effects that would have.
Okay, on to our final question. We're just on the hour mark, but we'll get through this. It's on hopping. Let's say I want to produce a dry hopped IPA, but I want it as clear as possible. So the opposite to the first question that we had about murk and haze. What's the best way to use a clarifier? Post-fermentation, pre-dry hopping, post-dry hopping, same time as dry hopping. Over to our hop expert.
Well, I would. I mean, there's various ways to do it. I mean, it's what works best in your brewery, because it's all down to fermenter shape, size. You got shallow, wide fermenters or tall, steep conicals. Are you moving from your primary fermentation into maturation vessels? Are you moving from maturation vessel to a bright beer tank? So there's a big combination of the way you can make things work. But personally, in my experience, what I would do is I would add my adjunct findings, so silicates or polysaccharides, at the end of fermentation. I'd skim, add my findings adjunct, and as the temperature cooled, the findings, the clarifier would work, and it would drop out all the solids to the bottom. And then after maybe 24 hours, I would then dry hop, because you've taken your temperature down. Depends what you, I mean, if you're fermenting an IPA, so you're fermenting at 20 degrees. So if you've dropped down to sort of maybe 15, 14 degrees, you've dropped a lot of your protein material out, and you add your dry hops. And as that gets mixed around, you still have hopefully a little bit of convection there. And as it's cooling even farther, you should drop the solids out, leaving the hop material behind. If you're moving to a maturation vessel, it'd be a similar kind of a thing. You'd add a clarifying agent into your primary fermenter, and then you dry hop your maturation vessel, because you get some, as you're moving beer, you get some movement and move the hops around. I mean, if you're going to go through a bright beer tank, then you could add again. A lot of these vegetarian type findings, such as silicates or polysaccharides, they're good for sort of one movement, but after that, if you haven't taken the material, then you're going to maybe have some carryover. I mean, the other thing is, as you know, we've talked about various mashing regimes. I mean, make sure you or add some kettle findings into your boil to break out all the cold break, get as much protein out as possible. I say I quite like bright, clean, crisp beers, but I don't mind the natural haze on the beer. Some of the murky ones aren't great, certainly in the UK, because what they're actually creating the haze with is yeast. Yeast gives me a nasty sort of coating on the mouth, kind of metallic flavor. But when it's just proteins that are causing that haze, that natural haze, I think they're fantastic. So Brian, they make great NEPAs. Garage Brewery in Barcelona, again, they're the same. Those beers are great. There's no yeast carryover. I believe they've got a chloride ratio and various other things down there. But just handle the beer well. I mean, if you take care of your beer, every movement all the way through the stage, that's where you're going to get your best results, because you want to make sure that your consumer is drinking the beer as you want it when it leaves the brewery. Certainly in the UK, certainly in the past 20, 25 years ago, we had problems with people getting the beer and mismanaging the beers. So, when that beer leaves your brewery, it's in the best shape it can be in. But then somebody down the road's leaving it out in the warm. Certainly I've seen this in Southeast Asia. The guys are making fantastic beers. They're going and sitting in a back alley somewhere in the back of Saigon, and the beer is heating up to sort of, 40 degrees. And then when they get to the bar, the beer is terrible, and they're wondering why. It's certainly in the UK. Once upon a time, when I were a lad, they would always blame the landlord, but the small brewery beers, it was always blamed on the breweries. So we always have to take it very, very careful, make sure we did as much as we can. But again, for just clarifying your beer, it really it depends on what system you've got. I would try to get as much yeast out as possible by doing it after primary fermentation, and then working downstream. And you can add some more. I mean, I know one of the brewing material companies has a product that they've launched in the last 2 years, which specifically for sort of to drop beer bright in tank prior to packaging or bottling or filtering. So I hope it helps somewhat. It's difficult without looking at the process to sort of make a good suggestion. But certainly I would do it at the end of primary fermentation, and then dry hop after that.
Very good. Any more from the panel on that specific topic about clear beers? Oh.
Brian, nothing to say.
Nothing to say on clear
Good job,
beer.
Andy. Good job.
Excellent. Well, that's our questions for today. Thank you so much, everyone who's joined us watching at home, and indeed to our panelists for giving up their time as well. Next week, Chris, we're going to be back with a presentation on conditioning, and so we will be talking a bit about clarifiers and about haze, and about getting optimal the beer in an optimal state through conditioning for packaging. So do join us again next week at the same time in the same place. But for now, stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you again. Thank you very much for your time. Cheers.
Bye, everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks very much.